The night my grandfather turned 80, I watched my mother do something I will never forget for the rest of my life. It happened so fast that if I had blinked, I would have missed it. 1 second, she was reaching across the table to pour herself more white wine, and the next her other hand dipped briefly over my glass just for a moment, just long enough, and then she pulled back and smiled at my uncle across the table like nothing had happened at all. Like she hadn't just dropped something into her eldest daughter's drink at a birthday dinner in front of family photos and a cake shaped like a fishing boat. I didn't move. I didn't gasp. I just sat there with my hands folded in my lap and felt something go very, very cold inside my chest. My name is Sarah, and I am 31 years old, and that night in my grandparents' house in Barrie, Ontario, was the night I finally understood that my mother had never loved me the way she loved my sister. Not even close. Let me back up. My grandfather, Papa, that's what we called him, the old French-Canadian habit that stuck even though we grew up speaking mostly English, had spent his entire life building something. He came to Ontario from Quebec when he was 22 with almost nothing, got a job at a manufacturing plant outside Barrie, and over 40 years worked his way up, saved obsessively, and eventually bought 3 rental properties in Simcoe County. Nothing glamorous, small houses, older tenants, steady income. But by the time he turned 80, those 3 properties were worth just over $1.2 million combined, plus the family home on Dunlop Street that he and my grandmother had shared for 50 years. My grandmother passed 4 years ago. After that, Papa's health started slipping. Nothing dramatic at first, the usual things. A hip replacement, some memory fog, a general slowing down that happens to people in their 80s. But by the spring before his birthday, his doctor had started talking about cognitive assessments, and eventually gently, about power of attorney and estate planning. That's when my mother started calling him every single day. I should tell you about my family so you understand the whole picture. My parents married young, had me, and then had my sister Claire 4 years later. Claire and I are not close. We were never close. She was the one who got new clothes while I got hand-me-downs, the one whose recitals my parents never missed while my volleyball tournaments were apparently always scheduled at inconvenient times. I'm not bitter about childhood anymore. I did that work in my 20s. Paid for it myself with a therapist I found through my work benefits, but I'm telling you the facts because they matter. My parents have always struggled financially. My father works in sales and has what I can only describe as a complicated relationship with. Money makes decent commissions some months, almost nothing in others. Spends like it's always the good months. My mother has worked part-time at a dental office for 15 years and seems to view Papa's eventual inheritance as a retirement plan she never had to save for herself. I, on the other hand, moved out at 22, got my accounting designation, and have worked for a mid-size firm in Toronto for 7 years. I rent a 1-bedroom in Leslieville. I have my own RRSP. I do not ask my parents for money, and I haven't since I left. Papa always said, quietly, that he planned to divide everything equally between his 3 grandchildren, me, Claire, and my cousin Matthew, who lives out in BC. He told me this directly one Sunday afternoon when we were having coffee at his kitchen table, just the 2 of us. He said, "Sarah, I want you kids to be taken care of. All 3 of you, equal shares." He said it like it was settled, like it was already done. I think my mother overheard that conversation. Or something like it. Because about 2 months before his birthday, the dynamic shifted. Suddenly, my parents were driving up to Barrie every other weekend. My mother was organizing his pill case, calling his doctor's office on his behalf, taking him to his appointments. On the surface, completely loving. Any outside observer would have called her a devoted daughter-in-law. I called it something else privately, but I kept my mouth shut and stayed in my lane. Then my cousin Matthew called me in September. "Has your dad said anything to you about Papa's will?" he asked. I told him no. "I got a weird call from your mom last week," he said. "She was asking if I'd ever thought about giving up my share, like, voluntarily. Said Papa's care was getting expensive and that family should help carry the burden. She made it sound like if I signed something, it would help him." I felt the first real twist of unease then. I told Matthew not to sign anything. I told him I'd look into it. What I found, when I quietly looked into it, was that my mother had been attending Papa's legal appointments with him. His longtime lawyer in Barrie, a man named Mr. Arsenault, who had handled Papa's affairs for decades, had apparently retired the previous year. The new lawyer was someone my mother had recommended, someone she had found. I called Mr. Arsenault, who was semi-retired but agreed to speak with me. He told me that when he'd last worked on Papa's estate documents, 2 years prior, the will specified equal division among the 3 grandchildren, with a modest gift to my parents for their caregiving role. He said he didn't know what had changed since he'd stepped back. I called Papa directly and asked if I could come visit. He seemed happy to hear from me. Warm, clear that day, himself. But when I gently asked about his estate plans, he got a little vague in a way that worried me. He said your mother, meaning my mom, has been helping sort things out. He said there was going to be a meeting with the new lawyer soon. He couldn't remember exactly when. That was when I started recording. I want to be clear about what I mean. I'm an accountant. I understand documentation. I also understand that in Ontario, secretly recording a conversation you are a participant in is legal, and I had begun to feel, in that quiet accountant part of my brain that tracks things and notices discrepancies, that I needed to protect myself, and prepare, and Matthew. So I started keeping notes. Dates of my parents' visits to Barrie, the name of the new lawyer, anything Papa mentioned that seemed off. And I started carrying my phone in my breast pocket when I visited, voice memo running. I am not proud of this, but I am not sorry either. The birthday party was my aunt's idea, Papa's sister-in-law, a kind woman named Diane, who had known him since the 60s, and who organized the whole thing with the cheerful efficiency of someone who still writes thank you notes by hand. The family home on Dunlop Street, decorated with photos from every decade of his life, the fishing boat cake, about 20 relatives crowded around a table that was never quite big enough. My parents arrived before I did. When I walked in and found my seat, I noticed that my mother had arranged the place settings. She had put herself next to Papa. She had put Claire across from me. I sat down, I poured myself a glass of water from the pitcher on the table, and I set my phone to record in my cardigan pocket. Dinner was warm and loud in the way big family gatherings are, everyone talking over each other, my great-uncle telling the same 3 stories he always told, my father laughing too loudly. Papa was having a good night. He looked happy. He looked like himself. And then, about 40 minutes into the meal, during a moment when most of the table was focused on my great-uncle's 3rd story, I glanced over, and I saw my mother's hand. She was holding a small, folded piece of paper. No, not paper. One of those little pharmaceutical packets, the kind you tear open, and her hand moved over my water glass, and something went in, and the hand pulled back. I watched it like it was happening in slow motion and in another dimension at the same time. She picked up her wine and turned back to the conversation on her other side. I looked at my glass. The water looked the same. I looked at my mother's profile. Normal. Completely normal. My heart was hammering. My hands were steady. This is one of those things I've noticed about myself in crisis. My emotions go loud on the inside and very quiet on the outside. I thought, if I say something right now, at this table with Papa watching, in front of everyone, what happens? She denies it. The glass gets knocked over. There's no proof, she cries. My father defends her. Claire looks at me the way she always looks at me, like I am being dramatic, like I am making a scene, like I am the problem I have always been. I thought, there is another way. Claire was sitting across from me, her own glass half empty. At the moment when the table went loud again over something Papa said that made everyone laugh, I stood slightly to refill my plate from the dish in the center of the table. And in the natural movement of reaching and shifting and passing things around, I slid my glass across toward Claire's side of the table and brought her empty glass back to my spot. Claire didn't look up. She was on her phone under the table, half present the way she always is at family things. A few minutes later, she picked up the glass and drank. I want to tell you what I felt in that moment. Honestly, because I think this is the part of the story people will judge, and I think they are entitled to. I felt afraid. Not for Claire, not yet, but for myself, for Papa, for what it meant that my mother had just done what I watched her do. I also, in some cold, quiet corner of my mind, thought, whatever is in that glass is now going to tell me exactly what she was planning. Because if nothing happens, maybe I was wrong. Maybe it was something else. Maybe I imagined it. I did not imagine it. About 20 minutes later, Claire set her fork down and said she felt dizzy. Then she said the room was spinning. My mother's face did something complicated, a flash of something I can only describe as calculation, and then immediate, seamless concern. She was at Claire's side so fast it almost looked rehearsed. She needs some air, my mother said, standing, hand on Claire's arm. She just needs some air. My Aunt Diane said Claire looked pale. Someone pulled out a chair. My father appeared at my mother's elbow, and I stood up and said, clearly and calmly, I need someone to call 911. My mother looked at me. Sarah, I need someone to call 911, I said again, because I saw what went into that glass. The table went absolutely silent. My great-uncle set down his fork. Papa looked from me to my mother and back. Claire was slumping in her chair. What are you talking about? My mother said. Her voice had gone flat and careful. I'm talking about what you put into my water glass 40 minutes ago, I said, which Claire drank. And I would like someone to call for help right now, please. And I would like no one to move or touch anything at this table. My father started to speak. I held up one hand. I have been recording since I sat down, I said. Please call 911. It was my cousin Matthew who had driven down from BC specifically for the birthday, who had been sitting at the far end of the table watching all of this, who picked up his phone and made the call. The ambulance came. The paramedics took Claire. They also, at my request, took my water glass, the original one, which was still sitting where I'd left it, which no one had moved in the chaos. I had not touched it after the switch. I pointed to it and I told the paramedic, quietly, what I had seen, and he looked at me for a long moment, and then he bagged it. My mother kept saying it was nothing. It was probably just too much wine. Claire had always had a sensitive system. There was no need for all of this. The Barrie police service arrived 20 minutes later. I gave my statement outside on the front step of my grandfather's house on Dunlop Street, with the birthday decorations still visible through the window, while the officer wrote everything down. I sent the voice recording from my phone to my own email while the officer was standing there, so there was a timestamp, and then I showed him I had done it, and I offered to share it immediately. Claire was kept at RVH Royal Victoria Regional Health Centre overnight for observation. She was going to be okay. What she had been given was identified as a fairly high dose of a sedative, something in the benzodiazepine family, the kind of thing that in a healthy adult would have meant hours of unconsciousness rather than anything fatal. The detective who called me 2 days later was careful about what she said, but she confirmed they were treating it as an investigation. My mother was arrested the following week. My father, it emerged, had known something was planned. He hadn't known the specifics, he claimed, but his phone records and the conversations I had recorded over the previous 3 months told a different story. The new lawyer my mother had brought in was already under scrutiny for other matters. It turned out this wasn't the first time he had been involved in a situation where an elderly person's estate documents had been quietly adjusted during a period of reduced oversight. What my mother had actually planned, as it came out over the following months, was this. She needed me incapacitated, not hurt, not dead, just out of the picture for the appointment with the new lawyer that was scheduled 4 days after the birthday party. The appointment where Paper, with my mother present and me absent, was going to sign a revised will. A will that removed equal distribution and redirected the primary inheritance to my parents as Paper's dedicated caregivers, with a significantly reduced share for Matthew and nothing for me. Her reasoning, apparently, was that if I showed up impaired or ill or behaving strangely, she could explain it away, or if I simply didn't show up. She had planned to tell Paper I had been too unwell to come. What she didn't plan for was that I had been paying attention for 4 months, that I had Mr. Arsenault's phone number, that I had Matthew on my side, that I had been recording. Paper had a long conversation with Mr. Arsenault, who came out of semi-retirement to assist with the situation and helped him connect with an independent estate lawyer with no ties to my family. Paper's cognitive assessment, done properly and without my mother in the room to prompt answers, confirmed that he had capacity. His estate documents were reviewed and restated to reflect what he had always intended, equal shares for the 3 grandchildren. He cried when he called to tell me. He apologized. He kept saying he hadn't understood what was happening around him. I told him the truth, which was that none of this was his fault, and that I was just glad he was all right. Claire, for her part, was a complicated situation. She and I had never been close, and she had spent most of our lives treating me as an inconvenient presence, and she had drunk a sedative meant for me. She called me from the hospital the night she was admitted, the only call she made, other than to her boyfriend. She didn't say thank you. She didn't apologize for 20 years of coldness. What she said was, I don't understand why she would do that. And I said, I know. I'm sorry. Because I was. Not for anything I had done, but for the fact that my sister had spent her whole life being the favorite, and the favorite had still not been safe. That was a hard thing to sit with. I don't know what Claire does with that. I don't know what she does with the fact that our mother was willing to risk her, that the people who had centered their entire family around her had treated her ultimately as a tool. I hope she gets a good therapist. I hope it's one with good benefits coverage. I stayed in Barrie for 3 days after the party. I slept in my old room, which Paper had kept exactly the same twin bed, the blue curtains my grandmother had chosen, a shelf with some of my old books on it. In the mornings, I made coffee, and we sat at the kitchen table and didn't talk about any of it. We talked about the fishing trips he used to take in Muskoka. We talked about my grandmother. We talked about whether I had ever tried ice fishing, and I said no. And he said that was a failure of my Canadian upbringing, and I laughed, and so did he. On the 3rd morning, before I drove back to Toronto, he put his hand over mine and said, You protected us, Sarah. You and Matthew. I didn't cry until I was on the 400 South, just past Innisfil, when the adrenaline of the last 72 hours finally wore off and I cried so hard, I had to pull over at a gas station in Bradford and sit in my car for 10 minutes. Then I blew my nose, merged back onto the highway, and drove home. The criminal case is still working its way through the Ontario court system. These things take time. My mother is out on bail. I don't speak to her or my father. I don't know if I ever will again. I've thought about it a lot in the months since, and I keep coming back to the same answer. There are people you can forgive and still keep at a distance, and there are people you forgive entirely for your own sake, quietly, in the privacy of your own heart, and then simply do not see again. I think that second category is where my parents will end up for me. Papa is doing well. He has a different caregiver arrangement now, a PSW from a reputable agency that Matthew and I vetted together, and I drive up to Barrie once a month for Sunday coffee. His memory has some bad days, but he knows me every time. Every single time. This past March, on the 1-year anniversary of that birthday party, I drove up on a Saturday and brought butter tarts from the bakery in Bradford he's always liked. We sat at his kitchen table with our coffee, and the late winter light coming through the window my grandmother had always kept so clean. And he told me again about the fishing trips, and I listened like I hadn't heard the stories before, because some stories are worth hearing more than once. If you are watching this and something in it sounds familiar, a family member who is a little too attentive to an aging relative's finances, a dynamic that has always felt off, a situation where you keep telling yourself you're probably imagining it, I want to tell you something I wish someone had told me earlier. You are probably not imagining it. Document everything. Trust the accountant part of your brain that tracks discrepancies. And know that protecting yourself and the people you love is not betrayal, no matter who tries to tell you otherwise. That's all. That's the whole story. Karma's Snare. See you next time.